Hello and welcome back to Parley. These are my on-the-spot responses to the prompts you folks submit. Hope you'll enjoy listening. This one is from Just Rusty. It's about roguelikes as blackjack. Just Rusty says, while looking at what The Last Spell, a game you talked about in a previous Parley, does with its build system, I realized that almost all of the game's more interesting choices boiled down to power now versus power later. In many ways, that is just blackjack. Hit me when you invest in power later, and then you bust if that doesn't work out. You die and lose the run because your power later investments didn't pay off before you get it. It's blackjack, kind of. Yeah. We could stop right there. Cool. It kind of is. That's interesting. How close can I get to failure, Just Rusty continues now, without actually failing? I then started to see this same pattern in single-player Buildcraft games everywhere, especially roguelikes. I think one of the reasons I love Against the Storm, not familiar, at least I don't think I am so much, is that it's much less about this flying close to failure problem and more about sequencing and assembling the parts of an engine effectively, efficiently. One of the things that came up during the rock, paper, scissors crew parlay is that most competitive games can at some point be reduced to rock, paper, scissors with extra steps. In many ways, it's the ground state for competitive games. So, is blackjack the default or ground state for roguelikes? And can you think of any other frameworks single-player buildy games build off? Cool. Pretty compelling. I think that, yeah, they are. That formula basically is blackjack. Neat. So there's a couple of parts to this parlay. Unpack the build system / in a roguelike as blackjack thing. Also, is that good? These aren't made to be value judgments. When you all heard most competitive games can at some point be reduced to rock, paper, scissors with extra steps, whether you think that's a good thing or not will depend on the person. I would just like to spend some time establishing that it is definitely at least good and bad. There are some good parts and there are some bad parts. It's not just good or bad. And I don't think it's like, we're not trying to be reductive here. There are a lot of extra steps in many cases that keep competitive games from being rock, paper, scissors. And it's the same thing here, but I think you'll see it is a little bit like blackjack. And then what you're asking is other frameworks, basically. So unpack it's blackjack thing. Is this good? What ways is it good or bad in? What do we think about that? And there's also an additional point I want to add there, because I think it applies a lot more broadly than just the roguelikes, and still feels like blackjack. You kind of bust appreciably, even in games where you don't literally die and lose the run if you bust by investing too much in future power. And then, yeah, different formulations. Just to give you a warning ahead of time, I would say I'm like, I feel about that confident that I can give you like a different paradigm of gameplay for these games. There's this idea in game design of game essence, the sort of core of the game, the core, fun thing that the game is built around, the push and pull that the game is built around. So in many single player games, blackjack, yeah, you kind of invest in your setup being more powerful now or later, and investing well will cause you to get a high total but not bust. Basically, just like how in a competitive activity, rock, paper, scissors is obviously random unless you get into mind games, and there's like a different, you could say, different style to operating things. When you make rock, paper, and scissors more complicated, obviously that creates changes in the player. But in many cases, for example, competitive trading card games are pretty rock, paper, scissorsy at times, but just with a lot of extra steps, a lot. And it's a place where you can argue that the extra steps make it more interesting than rock, paper, scissors. But anyway, they're blackjack. I mean, it is a lot like blackjack. So let's unpack the blackjack part. We're also going to unpack the roguelike thing because it differs a lot depending on the amount of meta progression in the game. So we'll address that in a few minutes. The blackjack thing, just to make sure everyone's on the same page. I don't want to spend too long on this because Just Rusty, you clearly understand it, and I think I totally get what you mean. It's a good point, but I think it's worth unpacking a little because we are going to get into the weeds of exactly what is like blackjack. You play a game, and you're going along through the game, and it's either a run in a roguelike situation or it's like a linear RPG. We're going to bring up those a lot. story based, but you kind of also build characters and you have a party of characters that do the content with you. An RPG, something like that. A game like this, and the game gives you options to get stronger. You can spend money on equipment or gear or potions or bombs or something, or you get a boon or an upgrade of some sort that can make your character powerful temporarily or permanently, permanently. And you will often have the option to pick something that is consumable or not, or kind of works with something else or not. And on a broader sense, obviously, the aspect of build systems we're digging into is synergy. Basically, picking power later is picking a synergy piece, something that maybe isn't that good now, or maybe even does literally nothing now, but which you need to get to a future point. This could be anything from a buff that makes your next 3 attacks do poison, but poison doesn't stack in this game, so you now want an attack that hits multiple targets for it to be as good as it can be, and it's not that much of a damage increase until you have that ability. Or it could be as simple as, I want that talent on the talent tree, and this one is in the way, in the middle, and I'm not going to use this, but I'm going to buy it now so that in the future I can get this one. Could be something as simple as that. Versus, my character is this right now, and for the very next fight, the thing I'm lacking is a melee attack. So even if that doesn't fit my build on the whole, I'm going to pick that now because it makes me stronger right now. Again, in a roguelike, you might need to do this to prevent yourself from losing the run immediately, but I'm going to propose in this first section that it's actually pretty similar even if it's not a roguelike. Briefly unpacking the roguelike thing, because it matters a lot for this topic. I feel like I explain this about 50% of the time that roguelikes come up. There's roguelike and then roguelite. I argue that this is not a meaningful distinction. Time was, we had Rogue, a game where you do a run and then die and it totally resets. Everything resets and you have to clear it from the start. And then people made more of those. But a very big innovation point in that area of game design was meta progression. You get some currency or resource, or you level up in some appreciable way. And some aspects of the difficulty involve learning better and honing your abilities, gaining more knowledge, but also getting better at operating the game's controls or whatever that is, making better decisions, getting used to what is in the game. But also some of it comes down to your character getting stronger. And I see this as a pretty good thing. I would imagine there are people who don't like that and think it's not, I don't know, it feels like a purism argument. You're not just improving, the game just improves for you and you have to grind. But in a roguelike that is, I think, well balanced, there's this push and pull where the game objectively rewards you for spending time trying to figure it out, but also you do still need skill and knowledge to overcome the challenges ahead of you. I think there are lots of games where if you literally try to just grind and don't do anything special with difficulty or whatever, that isn't enough. Like, you do still need to do those other skills. The game is just giving you an assurance that you will progress if you do that. I don't really see this as being that different. It's not even really about necessarily making the player so much more powerful in many cases. There's a good amount of roguelikes. Hades 2 recently comes to mind, where a lot of the raw power the player gains is gained right at the beginning, and is really just a soft tutorial. It's very useful to think of games as still being in a silent or invisible tutorial step for the first 10 to 20 hours of gameplay. A lot of games do that. You'll notice it if you start looking for it. And if you look at Hades 2 that way, you'll notice that a lot of the Arcana card tree that you're building up and unlocking has objective power benefits early and then becomes trade-offs or side benefits, or you're more likely to get a good boon, but you combining it in a way that's helpful is still up to you, that kind of thing. A simple example of this is if you look at the bottom cards of the Arcana tree, a lot of them are rerolls, which do absolutely nothing unless you know what you're looking for, basically. Versus the top of the tree will be stuff like, you have 3 extra lives. Obviously that gives you a huge just raw power increase, right? But I would argue that the game is relatively balanced around you having that top stuff. And then the bottom stuff is very vaguely, very loosely, you figure it out and it lets you kind of engage with the game a little bit more. A lot of that is more just tools to use the knowledge and skill you gained, rather than directly, strictly making you more powerful, even if you yourself don't change in any way. You still have to have knowledge and skill to make use of those traits to an extent. Again, just an example, I feel you'll find a lot of games are like this, even if you don't agree Hades is that way. That's just my way of framing it. The point is, Roguelite gameplay, where you progress meta progression, is arguably not even in service of something that different than roguelike gameplay in the strictest sense, where you have no meta progression at all. That's not true in every game. There's also a really big divide in roguelikes, which I'm just going to call the whole genre roguelikes, where some of them are not about controlling the randomness. A lot of them are just really random, and so upgrading how objectively strong you are kind of reins in the randomness by just making you like baseline stronger. Without getting into it too much, I just think it's worth dividing that. There's technical roguelike and then roguelite, which is the modern roguelike genre. They're all like that, basically. And then there's also the more randomness versus the more intentional build focused, improvisation focused ones. And I think this is helpful. Here in this parlay, we are mostly referring to roguelite, synergy, or improvisation focused games, not so much leaning into randomness and not so much leaning into the purism of you gain absolutely no additional power between runs. Almost all of the current modern roguelite, if you want to call it that genre, is that way. There's very few games that would be the technical old definition of roguelike, and the way we use language is that that is now what roguelike means. And I'm pleased personally, maybe that's childish of me, to see that a good amount of the general public just says roguelike now, because it doesn't make sense to specify roguelite. They almost all are roguelites. So the form of the roguelike genre we have is that. I'm just going to call them roguelikes. But just be aware, if you've played any of these games, well, almost all of the ones you've played have meta progression, so we're assuming that. And this is important, because obviously if you have meta progression, I planned this parlay out, if you bust by investing too much, remember, we're talking about it's blackjack, remember? You invest a lot in future power or synergy, and you bust. That is, you don't get that power payoff before the roguelike run gets hard enough, and then you die, and the run resets. But you're playing almost all roguelikes, which have meta progression in them. So you still got some resource from doing that. Is it necessarily that bad? And you may know, if you've played a lot of these games, that it's kind of weirdly common that these games will allow or permit, like in the rules of the game, you can do this, but they probably didn't do that on purpose. Just kind of spam doing runs really fast to get a lot of currency in the game. I believe a good amount of roguelikes do this intentionally. The idea is that if the player is struggling, they kind of gear up faster. Just another example from Hades and Hades 2. It happens in both of them. If you play a run of Hades or Hades 2, you'll notice that the early stages of the run, areas 1 and 2, going up or down, have much more of the meta progression currency. And when you get to parts 3 and 4 of the run, they almost entirely taper off. You get much less of the meta currency. Sometimes you'll get it on less rooms, but they'll give you more of it. You'll get a big bundle of gems or whatever when you get to a higher floor, but only that one room on that floor will have gems. The point is, earlier in the run, they give you more of that currency. The idea being that if you are having trouble, well, the game kind of calls to that and speeds up how much you get meta progression currency. If you're doing a good job, you don't need more of a power spike from the game as quickly, so the game subtly gives you less meta progression currency relative to how much of the game you're succeeding at. But you also need less of it, because if you're progressing further in the game, that means that you're doing your part. The skill and knowledge improvement is going better for you. Thus, the game evens out a little bit. It's kind of clever. Again, for some players, maybe that doesn't seem pleasant, but I do think that's like a smart idea in theory. You see the point. It's relevant here because it suggests that it's a little bit more complicated than literally blackjack. There is this additional element where if you bust, almost all of these games that actually exist in the modern day do something about you busting. Now, in the second part of the parlay, I want to do something a little weird, but I think it's really sensible. I personally think that you can extend this idea that it's blackjack to most games with build systems that are single player, using something like that reasoning. If you don't focus too much on the bust moment, you invest too much in future power or synergy, it doesn't pay off, and then you lose the roguelike run or whatever. Yeah, you do, but a lot of these games are kind of designed for that to happen to an extent, and obviously the point of blackjack is not to never lose. Like that, I mean, I guess that is the point of it, but like, it's not like not playing blackjack if you bust some of the time, it's normal. And I hope you would agree that for most people, the ideal roguelike experience is you die without winning the run some amount of the time, right? It's designed around that. Blackjack doesn't really have a mechanic for this other than if you play a bunch of rounds of blackjack, well, it's basically your wallet, right? Gambling. You have that amount of chips or whatever it is. And you lost this round, which means you, ironically, lose meta progression currency, which we call money in the real world. Shit. But in video games, it's designed to call to that. So here's what I'm going to do. Now imagine an RPG. You're rolling along, singing a song in this game where you do not die and then it resets your whole build. It's a linear story-based campaign style game. You've got like talent trees or gear or both, I don't know, for your party members. And the same thing happens, right? You often make a decision about buying supplies in town or getting a new ability on their talent tree or whatever it is, where you either invest in power in the future, synergy more or less, versus power now. Now, it seems like you can't bust, though, right? Obviously, the difference on the surface appears to be that, well, if you die, you just go back to whatever save or what have you. But extrapolating a little bit further, I believe that in practice, most of these games do have a kind of bust state. It just looks different from how it looks in a roguelike. Again, in a roguelike, you still kind of can continue the game. You just get meta progression currency and that run is over. So let's look at it in RPGs. Well, let's imagine two basic fail states. You invest in power in the future, and it doesn't pay off before you have trouble now, versus you invest in power now, and you eventually needed more power in the future, but you don't have it, because you invested in power now so much. Let's imagine what happens to the player in these two states. So for the first one, you invest in power in the future, and the game doesn't actually, have enough of a challenge in front of you for that to pay off. So you begin to steamroll the game. You keep saying, hit me, hit me, hit me. And the game doesn't, if you don't just die and then the game will let you try again, then the player just kind of accelerates into infinite power. This is something you may have experienced in many games if you play modern, vaguely popular, or like AAA offerings that have build systems. They're designed for players that don't do this as a significant hobby for the general public. They're played by players that do it as a significant hobby, but they're marketing to the general public. So they don't assume that the player has build theory in their mind, obviously, and fair enough, right? But the result is that a lot of these games are really easy if you try to make something deliberately powerful, at all. My experience of this was in 1.0 Cyberpunk. The build system has changed, so I don't know right now, but my experience was the beginning of the game is by far the hardest, and around a third of the way through the game, it is ridiculously easy, even if you turn the difficulty up significantly. Once you get enough control to kind of bootstrap an intentional combination of effects, the game just falls apart. The game is not prepared for the player to do that. The game seems to assume that the player will invest their stat points and not make any intentional synergy. They will use the level up screen and spend their points, but they won't make anything better than the sum of its parts. And the result is that the game assumes that the player will plateau their power level. If I have 3 strength and I level up 20 times, well, the first 10 levels I go from 3 to 13 strength, which is a gigantic difference. But then in the next 10 levels, I go from 13 to, it caps at 20, if I recall, 20 strength. Way less of a difference. Not only did I just gain less because it caps off, I also had more of it already. So if strength gives you a certain boost to your damage per point, going from 3 to 13 versus, let's say, 13 to 23 is less of a marginal change anyway. That just doesn't give you as much of a benefit. I already have a lot of damage. For example, enemies that were dying to my damage, I don't get much better at killing those enemies. So your power would plateau if you built that way. But I mean, there are perks and gun effects and synergies in the game. If you use any of those, your power does not plateau. So you run over the game like a steamroller. And I've had this experience a lot, if you can't tell. There is a sort of inverse of busting when you say, hit me, hit me, hit me, I'll invest in power in the future, where the game is really hard right at the beginning. And so investing in the future makes it so you are too weak to overcome those challenges now. This parallels the opposite effect. The player invests in power now, and eventually the game gets strong enough that they aren't powerful enough to overcome those challenges. Those are kind of the same thing. You invest in power later and eventually, but you need it right now. You invest in power now, but you need it later, and then you don't have enough. Kind of the same. And then there's you invest in power later and the game doesn't put up enough of a fight later. So 2.5 forms of busting, if that makes sense. Now, again, you don't like bust. You can still play the game. You don't lose your character's builds or reset like in a roguelike. But you do mentally bust because, for example, if you need power now and you invest in power later, then you can't progress in the game now. You don't so much lose the run as brick your save file. You see what I mean? If the game doesn't let you change difficulty or respec and you invest in power later and you need it now, you are screwed. Like, you can't progress. If you invest in power now and you get to a part of the game where you need power later, if the game doesn't let you respec or change difficulty options, you're stuck. Like, it's at least possible you would be stuck. You bust, basically, is what I'm getting at. And if you get power later, but the game doesn't call to that power, there's a sort of bust. Yes, you can complete the game. For example, a lot of these games have a build system plus some other parts of the game that are meant to be appealing for reasons that are kind of unrelated to the build system, like a story. You can finish the story, but the build system part of the game has ceased to be interesting. For example, any new idea you have to get more powerful is completely useless because you're already an unstoppable killing machine, cyberpunk. And when I played it anyway, again, I would love for that to have changed. Maybe it has, but this was a long time ago. And I would argue that is a kind of bust. Some players will like it, for a little while at least. There's the power fantasy thing. But I hope you can agree that from a game design perspective, it has failed in that situation. Further, you will find the games are unfortunately often like this, at least in my experience, that they will kind of assume that players will do one or the other, and for some reason are seemingly ignorant of the other possibility. So the game is designed assuming basically nobody invests in power later. And so the game just totally rolls over and falls apart if you do that, versus games that assume you'll make an intentional build. Again, if they lack respecking and build systems, difficulty levels, Freudian slip, if they lack an involved build system, the ability to respec and then difficulty options, you can pretty easily just get stuck. There will be lots of players who just objectively cannot finish the game without intervening in some way. Again, this is like okay, I guess, but obviously if you pay for a game and invest time in playing it, it's reasonable for the player to want some recourse if they get stuck. That's not coddling people. It's okay for people to want to enjoy their entertainment time. And there are several relatively widespread and kind of easy ways to let the player keep progressing, like respecking and difficulty options. And if you have any objections to putting those in basically every game in existence, let's just say I have a lot of counter arguments. Let's get into it. For example, I'm currently playing a game called Arco, ARCO, recommended. I'll talk about it more some other time. But it doesn't, as far as I know, have the ability to respec, and it does assume that you make a decent setup and use your resources efficiently. I think it's absolutely possible that early mid act 2, if you've played this game, you will recruit that one guy for 15 gold, fight those bandits at the boring rock. If you've played Arco, you remember the rock that's described as really boring, and bandits jump out of it. This is a big difficulty spike in the game, and your first kind of mini boss. I think it's absolutely imaginable that some players will just not have selected a set of abilities that make this anything other than very difficult, basically. Impossible? I don't know. I mean, they spawn the first 2 groups of enemies next to explosive cactuses that one-shot them, but you have to notice that, and getting a clear shot is actually not trivial. You may not have a range attack on your other guy. It's not trivial. I think that's fair to say. I didn't find it super hard. I found it quite fun. I enjoyed that part of the game. But that's just it, right? I know I'm a player who is making intentional build decisions, and I found it challenging but fun. A little alarm should go off in your head where you go, oh, so this might be like significantly too hard. I not to be at all full of myself, just that I was thinking of the game as a different thing than a lot of players will be going in thinking of it. I didn't come up with any particularly clever build idea. I just naturally did the thing I do in all these games and thought a bit about the long term. If you don't do that, then you might need it, and if you don't, do it, then you'll be stuck when you need it. I did do it regardless of whether I needed it. I just find that more interesting, and so if the game needs me to have it, I will have it. Again, having the game be designed in a way that flexes to these things more would be good. That thing where Hades kind of vaguely tries to make it so if you're failing more, you get more meta progression currency, so you get more raw power, versus if you're succeeding more, you're evidently honing better, and so you're kind of doing that part yourself. We don't need to give you as much meta progression currency. Not that you like exactly get less of it. I know that's kind of more complicated, but you get it. So this is the narrative I'm giving you. I think that the blackjack metaphor is actually kind of better than it seems like it is, and applies to a lot of build systems. A lot of parts of games are basically just blackjack. So let's move on for the third part of the parlay to, so like, is anything not blackjack? Basically, and what are the benefits and detriments of those things? So on a basic level, I was mentioning how meta progression in roguelikes, now that that is almost ubiquitous and the roguelite genre is basically the roguelike genre, now that roguelikes are basically also meta progression, there is always this element where you kind of don't bust. And you could actually take my point from the previous section and say that it's a bigger problem in games that aren't roguelikes. Because in a roguelike, if you die, and then the game resets, but you gain some meta progression currency, well, this is playing the game, right? In blackjack, you lose some chips if you bust, or you win your bet and get a payout, and that amount changing is part of the game. That's supposed to happen. There's a difference in here where, yeah, you're not supposed to just die all the time, but the game is designed for that to happen a good amount of the time. Whereas in a lot of these linear experiences, campaign, RPGs, or whatever, just as the example I was giving before, well, the game isn't designed to handle that stuff. If you get stuck and you legitimately can't overcome the difficulty, and the game doesn't offer the ability to respec or change the difficulty, then you're stuck. That isn't an intended part of the gameplay loop. I mean, it's intended that you get stuck for a time, but you soft locking the game is not fully intended. Do you see what I mean? So there is a divide there where you could argue that what roguelikes do is actually make this a good game mechanic, rather than that it's the only place that it applies. And this is a problem that is unsolved in most other games' game design. I would agree with this. I personally think that until the industry understands and thinks about different ways people act with build systems more, and tries to find a way to kind of telegraph that or make it work for multiple parties, a lot of these games have a sort of secret genre attached to them, which is whether they think that you're going to not go for power later, or whether they think you are going to go for power later. And you kind of do need to know, but this isn't a thing in the public consciousness, and so you can't. You just have to play it and vaguely find out. You can't listen to reviews where people say it's hard or easy, because the perspective point of the reviewer completely changes what that means. It's just not related in many cases. It will be relatively hard, but gaming is a relatively deep hobby with a lot of different intensity levels or whatever. Someone saying this RPG was hard in no way confirms for you that it's a game where you'll want to make sure to carefully invest in power in the future, because you'll need it, but also in enough power now so you don't brick. Like, that's not a given at all, in my opinion, just because someone says it's hard or easy. So put another one on the pile of it's very difficult to review build systems. The point is, on the basic level, a way to kind of evaluate the blackjack thing is, well, roguelikes have sort of solved it. Meta progression does something to address that concern. I'll also give you a few examples of ways you can kind of further, or that existing games further, the blackjack thing without really changing the game essence. It's still basically blackjack, but there's some further framing attached to it. So I'll give you a few of those examples. In Chaos Zero Nightmare, there's this interesting thing where your save data, which is the result of your roguelike runs, is save data. Well, not for roguelikes. When you complete a roguelike run, or even if you die, the game takes a snapshot of what your roguelike run build was. It's a deck builder, so their deck and a little equipment. Pretty small little build. And saves it for you. And in the rest of the game that isn't roguelike, only part of the game is a roguelike with meta progression. In the rest of the game that isn't a roguelike, you can use the results of those roguelike runs as part of your build for that character. They just have a static build. You don't do a roguelike to make their deck and then play it. You just have the decks that you made that way, and then you play those with other stuff to make like your character's build. And obviously this is basically just furthering the meta progression thing, right? That does seem different. Do you want to hit or stay? But also you're kind of considering whether you want the build to be good in the roguelike to focus on winning the roguelike, power now or later in this run versus power later, like as save data in the future. Sure, but that's not really very different than saying, if this bet will make or lose me a lot of money, I will bet differently. You see what I mean? It kind of is still the blackjack game design. I personally do find this significantly more compelling because having a lot of different goals for a run all at once creates levels of drama and tension that I think are fun, and also creates different incentives. When you see a card or an effect in this game, it's interesting to think about whether it benefits you in a more complicated way. It might be that this makes your run more likely to succeed, and you would want this as power, as save data later. But right now you're really struggling, and these don't help you right now. It'll make the run go better later if you get there. And then if you get to that later part of the run and it's going better, then it will be good save data. But you might just die and fail both things. That's interesting. And a lot of the time, something obviously gives you power now and would be good for your save data if you survive the run or succeed and fill out a build, but it won't give you power later in this roguelike run. And so you might die without getting your full build set up. So it's good now and you want it for save data, but not good later in this roguelike run. You might just not win, and therefore not get as much stuff in your save data too. It's interesting. It adds a layer of tension. But I would say my evaluation, I wonder how you feel, is that that's not really different though. It just adds a very interesting additional knob. It's easy to think simplicity is better here, but rock, paper, scissors was improved by adding a lot of extra steps, in some cases, at least arguably improved. So why not blackjack? And I think that's, while blackjack might be a little bit more of a complete game as is, especially the bluffing part, which is obviously sort of different in this context. We're not getting into the metaphor that much. It's still true that, blackjack could maybe be more fun to people if you added some amount of stuff. And I think the addition of meta progression, a mechanic that works like your bank or your currency or your wallet in blackjack, is a good addition to these games. So just furthering that, not to be undersold. We don't have to end this conversation saying, well, I guess every piece of game design is boring because it's blackjack, just because we don't conclude there's something else. Furthering that in some way could still be really good. Remixing the game designs we have is not game design. Like that's cool. That's good. And I do think that an additional layer is add stakes to the player's run beyond just getting currency that makes them more powerful for future runs. Make it so they get something permanent in some way. I've said about Chaos Zero Nightmare in the parlays from iPatch Notes that we've done about it, that I think this is the beginning of a very big thing for roguelikes with build systems with the rest of the game, which is a surprisingly growing genre, by the way. Games that have a roguelike gameplay loop, but then significant other gameplay that is not a roguelike, but which uses some parts of the gameplay tools that you use in the roguelike, similar units or cards or even just mechanics, and that they interact in some way. That part is not uncommon already. And so adding this layer of your roguelike results are part of the build system for the rest of the game, I believe is a pretty big step. I think that has a lot of growing to do and is at a very early stage. I don't think Chaos Zero Nightmare is like a perfect or very beautiful version of it, even though I'm having a lot of fun with it. But I do think it will become there's a lot of potential there, and probably will be fulfilled. Okay, another one. Time for the build. The idea is that if you invest in power later, oftentimes there will be a middle step. So earlier I gave this example of maybe you want to get this poison buff for your weapons, but it's not really good until you have a good attack to use it. So you're going to invest in that and then this other attack. And when you have both, then you get your power spike. And then there's the other example of you want this trait, but on the way, you also have to get this, which you have no intention of using, or it's useless for your build. But you're going to invest in this, and then you're hoping that you don't die until you can get this trait above it. Well, an additional layer is added when the player has the feasible chance to pivot, is where I'm going with this. You invest in power later. You play through some more of the run or some more of the game you're playing, and the game gives you a different impression. Remember, you invested in power later, so you think you can get away with it. You think that you're okay for now, or you could be okay for now, and that you want to try getting a payoff that will take a little longer to get. But then you play a little more of the game, and the game says, the hell you are. You're not fine right now. Your build is garbage, and you get a lot of pressure put on you. You have a chance to pivot, to change your mind, or kind of alternate what you were going to do, to bail out of the strategy you had before, cut your losses, and try to make something else. Again, we're assuming that you can't just respec, though respecing would be a way to interact with this. In some cases, you might evaluate an option as you're moving toward a synergistic option you want, based on how likely it is to be useful if you fail to fulfill the synergy you have in mind, is what I'm getting at. And this is an additional layer that's added to a lot of these games that is a significant difference from blackjack. In a lot of games, it's not a very robust part of the game. You can think this way and it can be beneficial, but there's not like mechanics built around it. But there are definitely lots of games where there are mechanics built around this. There's some prominent part of the game where these generalist pieces kind of hook into these more specific pieces, and the specific pieces are always put at the end of talent trees. So when you're on your way to a specific synergy piece, you pick up generalist options that will be useful elsewhere if you keep an eye out. So you have to make a judgment call about that. That would be an example of something I think is closer to being this as an actual intended mechanic. You can think this in many games and it's useful, but yeah, I do think that focusing a game on that is a good step away from just making it feel like linear blackjack. If you have thought about this type of game design before, you may have experienced something like what Just Rusty is describing, this idea that you do feel like you're on your way to busting in a run. You didn't pick this thing early, or you picked this greedy option and something went wrong, and it's clear you said hit me, you got a big fat card, and now you're, look, I don't know blackjack that well, you've picked that up, but you get it. Your score is now really high and it's going to be risky to hit more. And you can feel that when you play these games. So what I'm suggesting is you can add a texture to it that is very obvious for these kinds of games, but I don't think is built into that much, where you, to say it another way, just change your mind about what your build is going for. You literally just change your mind about what the build wants to do. And if that's made to be an interesting process or an interesting mechanic, then there can be this prominent element to the game, to progressing in the game, that there wouldn't be otherwise, that now suddenly you have the option to go for this other build option, and this isn't as big of a payoff, but the option on the way is more useful if you have to pivot or like panic or something. A suggestion for a mechanic I have not seen before, but which would dig into this, would be letting the player assign a talent point to a talent tree in a way that is somewhat temporary, and then to progress further from that point, they have to lock it in permanently. In other words, the frontier, the edge of the player's progression in a talent tree in this game is always temporary. The very most recent thing they've gotten can always be taken back. And this creates a dynamic where you can kind of dip into something and then like maybe pivot in another direction, but you still need to commit to things as you go to build up a talent tree. You would maybe want to do something where you can't live in a space where you just get to the second to last trait in every talent tree and then just switch between them between fights. That's probably OP, but you could just make a mechanic where you have to lock in a certain benefit to get it. And that's what you need to do for like the end of a talent tree. Or you can't switch whether if you're going to try it, then you have to commit in some way. You could figure that out. If that was all it was. But you could create mechanics like this, you see what I mean, where the player has the ability to kind of bail out or trade away from an approach. There are games that touch on this in some way all over the place. Games where there are indeed kind of more generally useful upgrades on the way to a more specific upgrade. So you kind of could be on your way to one and then maybe change your mind. But my experience in this is it's usually a bad idea. If you've played these games before, often if you're invested enough in something, it's not usually that good of an idea with no other mechanics to support this, like respecking or the sort of quantum talents thing I just mentioned. to derail and do something else. You're often, even if you're not well off sticking with what you had, it's often just that it's such a big investment, right? Another way to approach this, then, which is a little weird, is to have the game resist optimization because you're very invested in what everything you picked before, because it is often effective to go like deep into that thing. By structuring a game around diminishing returns and not giving the player a huge reward for just dumping everything into one stat, you make it more likely that it makes sense for the player to make decisions during gameplay rather than just at the beginning. This is connected to the broader critique I've had of a lot of RPG game build systems, where it's weird. You probably need to enjoy making builds to enjoy these games, because the very first thing that you do, before even playing the game or knowing what any of this stuff does or anything, already a big flaw, you have to just make a gigantic character, you know. There are games that do it better or worse than others. You know, in Baldur's Gate 3, I think the way they guided the player through the early game part is like fine, and a lot of the skill checks are sort of self-explanatory, but a lot of them are not evenly spread through the game, or you don't know what they'll be useful for. Like if you've played tabletop D&D and your character gets speak with animals, I mean, this is a video game, so how useful is that? Like, how is that useful? You know what I mean? And if you've played Baldur's Gate 3, well, delightfully, they actually added a ton of animals that talk to you and have voice dialogue, and they put a lot of effort into that one little feature to kind of make the magic work for players. But the point is, you don't know that right when you start playing. Well, now you do, but most people don't. It's still a problem. I hope you'll agree. That the game kind of asks you to care about making a build, but once you start playing, it would be disastrous to try to change your build. Now, again, we have games where you can just respec. Like in Baldur's Gate 3, you can respec a ton. I would argue maybe so much that it's arguably even a little bit of a problem for some players, but it's still better than not having it. We could get into it some other time. Ask me for a parlay about why no games should not include respecing. Anyway, please, I beg of you. It doesn't have to be just Rusty. Well, this parlay is close enough. Thank you for kind of asking me that question surreptitiously without your willful intention. So yeah, the point is, a lot of those games have this situation where the core of the game design of a game like D&D is that you've made your own character in a certain way. So it makes some sense to make that a relevant mechanic as you progress through the game, but it usually is anything but. It would be, you either just can't change your mind, or it would be a very bad idea to derail your build and make something else. I've recently been playing Underrail, which doesn't have respecking, but let's just say you probably will want to respec, and it's very common that people restart a run after like 5 to 15 hours because they just didn't get to grips with their character. They were figuring out what their build is going to do. And this isn't the end of the world, but I do see it as a flaw. It's a thing where there's not an amazing explanation for why you really shouldn't be able to respec. I know many of these games are saying, since I've now said this like 3 times, that it would break your immersion if you could just change your character's abilities. But I personally feel like people arguing that in good faith are not genuinely considering the enormous benefits of respecing, the game-saving benefits of respecing. The benefits of respecing are just too broad. To say the potential immersion loss, if you care about that and want to respec, like, is just too bad. You know what I mean? Like, people can still choose not to respec. The game can still do things to encourage you not to flagrantly respec. We're getting off topic. The point I'm trying to make is just that there are a lot of games where it would be relevant to create more of a feeling like you're playing blackjack, actually playing blackjack, because in these games currently, you kind of decide how you're going to play blackjack, and then you play the whole game and you cannot change your strategy. You decide that you're going to invest in power later by setting up a build a certain way, and then you start the game, and it turns out you need power now, but the game isn't about making builds at any time other than the beginning. So you can't change your strategy. You invested in power later, hit me, hit me, hit me, and then the first card that's flipped over is a king, and you say, I'm screwed. I need to restart my game. And this is not the end of the world, but it is bad, in my opinion. It is still a flaw, and it's something that we can address this way. Have I sold good that this is a useful topic in game design for games other than roguelikes? My response actually has become steadily over the course of this parlay that it's the roguelikes where I feel like there's actually not much, like I don't have that many notes. You know, you can kind of keep fleshing that out. The save data example I gave in Chaos Zero Nightmare, but that's kind of got it handled. But actually, this metaphor makes a lot of sense for other non-roguelike experiences too. And for those, yeah, it's sort of weird. It's kind of just a genre standard that has been sitting around for a while. I do think it's worth noticing that these games are maybe trying not to get people to need to make a super involved build, but it's at the beginning of the game. And then the result is that the player can't change what they're doing in the middle of the game in the name of avoiding them making more build system decisions. The game has made it so people who don't have like that much knowledge of this type of game design are then stuck if they don't make a good choice or whatever. Whereas if you're more comfortable with these, your odds of making a good build from the start of the game that you then can't change are much higher. And so you wouldn't need it as much if there was more build stuff later. But there isn't. So if you did need that, then you're screwed. I don't know. I don't think that's not a good compromise currently. If you've played any amount of D&D or taught people any tabletop role-playing game, you know a huge flaw in many of these games is that the player has to do by far the biggest cognitive load activity, making a character and setting up the beginning of the game before they have played. That is so bad. That's such a glaring, massive flaw in game design. It's such a massive flaw, in my opinion, that I actually derailed my entire TTRPG group, stopped all gameplay for like several months so we could develop a homebrew way of kind of like randomly generating sort of characters at the beginning of the game while still allowing you to make all the build decisions you could normally make. Like by the time you're level 3, you basically got to do the equivalent of point buy as a D&D character, if you're familiar with that, or like normal ways of determining your stats. But initially, you just sit down and play with absolutely zero prep and characters just happen. And a lot of them die, and you see where it goes. If you are familiar with a game called Dungeon Crawl Classics, it's inspired by that, but we don't do it in a very similar way. I think there's a much more immediate and leaning into the strengths of the design way to make a bunch of low-level peasants, and then they all die in what Dungeon Crawl Classics very morbidly calls a funnel. Yikes. And then whoever lives, the players go, I guess that will be my player character. But then with the system I have set up, I've made a lot more, I guess you could call them compromises, to make it so the player can still make a full build. If you wanted to just make a build, on D&D Beyond and then play it with this, you can do that as normal with very little struggle or friction. It's designed to let you do that. I want to make builds, so of course I'm going to design it that way. Yet it also lets you get going immediately. I've no disrespect to the inspiration for the idea of Dungeon Crawl Classics, but I feel that they are just saying that they think it's good for players not to min-max, and they're not actually leaning into the real strengths of that design, which are you can play immediately, and it's not that hard to make it so you can basically make a deliberate character, as well as all of the benefits of that design. And you can encourage the player not to min-max their stuff without throwing that out the window. I also think that that desire is just a little shallow. You could just play with people who don't suck and don't want to monopolize the table, and so like they want to make a strong character, but they just don't want to be way more powerful than everyone else, because that's like a basic social courtesy to have that occur to you. Or just talk to your table. It might be fine for one person to be more powerful. That's just a lot to do for just getting people to not min-max, but then also not getting the other more objective benefits of that design. So I like mine a lot better is what I'm saying. But anyway, recommended if you're interested. You can definitely make games that lean into this more, that create blackjack-like mechanics, basically, that let you kind of derail how you're going to play. Choose whether you want to keep saying hit, or whether you're going to change your mind and stay, or you were staying and then you decide to hit during the build-making process in a linear experience. And I would argue it's actually more roguelikes that have kind of figured that out a little bit more than other games. As a little denouement, one of the things that you asked was if I can think of any other frameworks, completely different frameworks, not just evolutions of the framework, which I presented a few of. And I could not. in the time that I prepared for this. I had a lot of thoughts about this topic, but one of the things that I did not have an easy time with was another kind of basic elemental form of design. I don't mean to make excuses for myself, but the Q&A, AMA, whatever Parley is at this point, person in me wants to say, it's kind of predictable that we, like, when put on the spot, you won't be able to think of one. And it's the kind of thing where people listening and just Rusty and I will now that I've done this parlay and not said one, all easily think of, other archetypical examples. I looked through some games on my recently played list on Steam and like things I'd been doing in game design recently, and nothing came. So I'm sorry, I did the best I could given that I didn't think of those. Or maybe this is what you meant, that you wanted like developments of the blackjack thing. I think we covered that fairly thoroughly. I'm pretty happy with that. And yeah, I ended up slightly changing my mind. Maybe roguelikes as a design have this pretty sorted in some way. I do want to say that I liked the comment you made about less about like flying close to the sun, flying close to failure, trying to get power later as much as you can without dying, and more about sequencing and assembling the parts of an engine efficiently. I just wanted to add that I think that's an interesting tension you can include. In a lot of games, D&D again comes to mind, you're playing a paladin rogue for some reason, and it matters a lot what order you get that stuff in. Not just because there's stuff like your saving throw proficiencies that are determined by which one you take first, but also because if you are trying to survive the build at low levels, you might want to take one earlier than the other. And I think this is a really underplayed, really interesting aspect of multiclassing in D&D. Many builds are set up in a way where they kind of come online at level like 6-ish a lot of the time. They multiclass and they get their big thing from each of the multiclasses, or like they get extra attack or fireball or whatever, plus some other utility ability by, vaguely around level 7 or something, 8. But if you play them in a campaign and you don't start that at that exact level, after your initial order of multiclassing, that is whatever class you take first, which is important for like your proficiencies and saving throws, it doesn't really matter what order you take those levels in until you have both of the or all of the key features online. So you can have this fun activity that I think not everyone does. I think a lot of people just write down what order they're going to take things in. But you can have a lot of fun by dynamically adjusting what order you take things in. It's pretty common, in my opinion, that there will be these power now or power later decisions when you're multiclassing a character like this. And I've had a lot of fun playing these character builds live where I'm going to start with this, and at level 7 I want to have this, but for levels 2 through 6, I don't know, man, like I guess I'm going to pick based on how much I'm dying, basically, and try to keep the character alive. Again, as you've inferred, we play a very lethal type of home game. Most players end up running 1 or 2 characters, even after the funnel part at the end. And the way we begin every campaign is by killing 80% of your player characters. Like, that you've only had for like 2 hours, but I mean, still. And you didn't have to spend time creating. We roast a pyre of most of the character sheets, mini character sheets that we've made. And then whoever's left, it's not like the rest of the game is then rosy and easy. People die a lot in the campaigns that we run. And so it matters to have a character that will not bust and picks, chill enough options on their way up to their multi-class thing and then kind of gets online. And then there's often a feeling at around level 9 or whatever where the party has kind of made it and we get some super hard content, which then maybe also gets you killed, and you can figure out where to go from there. Your build didn't have plans, so you figure out where you go from there. It's cool seeing if you can get your build to peak early and get some really good combination early game to stabilize everyone. And if you play in a group, it feels really cool if someone can do that, but you know that they have this plan in the future, and then you can do something wicked greedy, potentially collaborating with the other players. It's a really interesting dynamic to add to the game, and one that this parlay made me realize is very absent from a lot of similar game design, at least in my opinion. It would be interesting to talk about more. What a big topic. I thought this one was going to be kind of easy to do a little bit shorter, but there's a lot to say about this. A very, very cool topic. Also very convincing, I just wanted to say. The blackjack thing is sort of brilliant. Folks, if you want to get your own parlay like this one, you can do that using a link in the description. We'd love to have you. I'm sure you're going to have better ideas for them than I would, because honestly, I get put on the spot about these and think, wow, that's more clever than the video essay I would have done with this 55 minutes is a little long. See you in the next one.